All right, so in just a couple minutes, we'll start on Chapter 7, but before we do, just so you see this, that means we are then done with the first section of the book. All right? So meaning that we didn't go through Chapter 1 because it was a repeat from the old book. We did 2, 3, and 4 and had our test. We did 5 on Wednesday. We did 6 yesterday, and we're doing 7 right now. And next week we'll have the test. And again, you will have a pre-test next week. So Monday I'm going to show you, I'm going to try to keep it to a half an hour, GitHub pages, so where you can grab that. If you don't want the Alfanos one or if it's not finished, you can grab any site you want that you've worked on. All right, but I'll show you how to push it out to GitHub pages. We'll do that on Monday. The rest of the period will be lab. Tuesday will also be a lab. I've already sent you this, but I'm just going over it for completeness sake. All right. So Monday lab, Tuesday lab, Wednesday we'll do the pre-test. All right. Thursday of next week will be the test. Hopefully you'll feel prepared by then. All right. And Friday will be a lab. Then notice the week after that, all right, we're going to go over 8, 9, 8, 9, and then 10 to 12, or 8, 9, and 10, and 11 and 12. I don't really care. But I'm hoping that those lectures, each one takes no more than about an hour. I'm doing that for completeness sake. No tests on 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12. No homework on 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12. No labs on 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12. Now, Mr. Gudmested may be doing it differently. I don't know. But this is the way I'm going to do it. Then the rest of the week, the 20th, 21st, and 22nd, there'll be lab for all 3 of those periods. Then we get into the meat, which is the more advanced part of the book that's towards the end. All right? I'm trying to bake in a lot of lab time in here because, again, you get enough homework, and that should give you enough time to start thinking about working on your portfolio. All right? And, again, I will give you a handout on that on Monday. I've just got to update it. And also to work on that midterm. All right? So with that said, let's jump into Chapter 7. And again, look, about 15 pages long. It's not a long chapter. And I don't believe there's anything on the test for that. I will double check by next week. All right? So in the last chapter it says we learned DOM skills. Now we're going to extend those to talk about images and about timers. Now I mentioned to you yesterday, I started talking to you about timers. And I talked about one-time timers, if you remember that yesterday, and I likened it to the old-fashioned wind-up alarm clock. And then we talked about interval timers, which go off on a regular basis, and I said that was more like a clock radio or a clock where you've got a snooze button. All right? And that's the truth. I mean, that's not going to change. Let me close all those. There we go. So what are we talking about in here? How to work with images. All right? How to preload images. The reason you may want to preload images is if you've got a site years ago, I don't do it much anymore, but for the pandemic and whatever, but I karaoke'd. And a friend of mine, when I was living out in Illinois, went to different spots, and once in a while he'd say, hey, can you come out? I don't know how many people we're going to have today, etc. All right? Well, the reason I'm telling you that is I came out once and to a place he had never been at before. It was a nice enough place. But the next day, they had, on their homepage, they had 50 little thumbnail pictures of him the night before. And you could click on any of those thumbnails, and it would show on the whole screen then what that was. You understand what I'm saying? And that's an example of kind of an image swap type of program. All right? And slideshows, maybe it's even closer to a slideshow. But we'll look quickly at the image swap. We'll look quickly at the slideshow. It is 9:11. We're probably going to be done closer to 9:30 than we are to 10 o'clock. All right? Just so you're aware of that. All right. So as it says, many web apps manipulate the images that they display in a browser. One thing is you should always go for, and I tried to show you that in the Alfanos. When you think about it with that Alfanos, there wasn't a boatload of text in there. All right, and my guess is I could be totally wrong with this, but let's just assume that Alfanos did have on their About page, they had like the history of Alfanos. If it was all text, you probably wouldn't find a lot of people out there looking at it. But if they put pictures, let's just say they've been around for 100 years, and if they had pictures from 100 years ago, then people are interested in stuff like that. You know, I've seen this before where somebody gets a book and the first thing they do is they start doing this. And I said, what are you doing? I used to ask, well, I don't have to anymore. They're looking to see how many pictures there are in it because they know that stuff they don't have to read. All right? That's why a lot of people like these books because they know at least every other page, yeah, it's code or it is pictures or whatever, but it's not just straight text. So the figure on the next page, and we'll look at it in just a minute, says list some of the attributes of the image element. You know these already. It's the source element, it's the alt tag. You can, again, add a width and a height, etc. All right? I'm not going to read that to you. You know what all that stuff is. All right, it says in most cases you'll use imaging software to create the images that are the right size. If you don't have that imaging software, I've already mentioned there's free stuff like GIMP. Some people like it, some people don't like it. But I've already shown you, too, how you can go in. The nice thing is typically if you go into Unsplash or you go into Pexels.com and you download like the large size, it's almost always about 1920 by 768. It might not be exact. But if it's, I mean, I've even gone in where it's 1920 by 780 and just manually gone in there and changed it. All right? You know, sometimes people do get real hinky when did you notice this image is a little bit smaller than the rest or a little bit bigger than the rest? And the reason I'm telling you that is Muroc violates that in the chapter here, and I want to show you what I'm talking about, okay? In just a bit. All right. So to work with an image in JavaScript, it says you'll use the HTML element image object. So we're talking about instantiating our own, for lack of better words. All right. And when I say that, I don't mean we're making our own images, but we're making existing images available in our web page. All right. So they talk next about preloading. As it says, in JavaScript apps that load an image in response to an event, the image isn't loaded on the browser until the JavaScript code changes. In other words, it's not put in there until you ask for it, type of an idea. All right, it says for large images or slow connections, this can cause a delay of a few seconds. And it's interesting, I'm not saying I have the fastest machine in the world here. It's not mine. First of all, it's the school's. All right, but we were doing a little bit, I had people go and download some database stuff we were working on earlier this week. And, you know, I had already downloaded it. I said, I'll give you a couple minutes. All right, so boom, it's not a big download, and you just accept all the defaults. I said, okay, we're ready to go on then, right? One guy said, no, I'm still on step 2 of 5. He said, my machine's really slow. And another person was on step 3. All right, so yeah, this stuff can take a while. And most people who go out and look at websites are impatient. All right? And I don't care if they're buying something or they're just looking. They're impatient. And if it constantly takes a lot of time for images to come up, they may leave. So as it says, to get around this, you can load the images before the event occurs. As it says, it's known as preloading images. Then the browser can display them without delay or without much of a delay. All right? So it says, although this may result in the page taking a little longer to load initially, the user won't encounter delays when using the application. Now, you may have heard of this term already, may not have it doesn't matter. But you've got a special part in the memory of your computer that's known as your cache, C-A-C-H-E. And like a lot of times, what will happen is, let's say that I go out to CNN.com right now. I'm not going to, but let's just say I did. And I take a look, etc., and boom, I leave, and I come back a half an hour later. If the page hasn't changed, probably what's happened is there was a copy of that home page that was cached onto my system, and it'll bring the cache one up, because it can bring it up a lot faster. All right, if it has changed, if there's a new picture on the front page or whatever, no, I'll get the new one. All right, so it says the second example that we'll look at in just a minute shows how to preload an image. First, as it says, you use the image constructor. What the hell does that mean? Well, you'll learn more about this next semester and a little bit at the end of this semester. But when you create a class, you basically lay out a blueprint for what objects of that class are going to look like. So again, if I did a class for human beings, so if I had a class called human, I would put in there like every human has a height, has a weight, etc. They can eat, they can drink. We've talked about this before. All right? But as it says in here, when you want to create a new human, so if I said, let Michael equal new human, all right, what happens is it calls the human constructor. And the constructor is basically, it's a special function or method that gets called when you create a new object. And that's what they're talking about right here. As it says, then you set the source property. You know how to do that already. This causes the web browser to preload the image. So again, if you've got a lot of images and you think that, or you've got very intricate images, you could basically say, hey, as soon as you come to the site, start preloading those, even if they're not there yet, just to try to speed things up. So there's examples of that. It says the last example shows how to preload the images for all the links on a page. So there's examples in here. Again, I don't think we have to talk about any of this stuff because you know that about images already. But notice how to create an image element object. Const image equal new image. And then after you do that, as it says, you can preload. All right? Or this is much more common. This is going to preload hyperlinks. So if you've got a series of images that have to load, that's how you do it. All right? And I don't want to sit and read to you because a lot of this stuff I've already mentioned, or you can just take a look at it on your own. Okay? All right. So next they talk about this image swap application. As they say, it's a common type of JavaScript app. There are other ways of doing image swaps rather than just using JavaScript. You can do image swaps using jQuery. I believe it's even possible to do image swaps in almost straight CSS. All right? So they show you the HTML on here. So and when you look, so when they're saying if we click here right now, that's the picture that shows. If we click here, that's the picture that shows. Now a little later, one of the examples they give, they've got 3 pictures that basically are more landscape like this, and they have one that's portrait. And I just think that looks bad. Now that's just me. Maybe that wouldn't bother you a bit, but people are just used to symmetry on sites, period. All right? So the HTML, what's new in here? Well, notice we took the unordered list and we gave it an ID. All right? Plus, if you notice where it says here, this caption that we've set up. All right? Then a paragraph that's going to hold that actual main image. The CSS, that's it. You know what display inline means now. We want those links. These are all hyperlinked. We want them to appear right after one another as opposed to it being on separate lines. All right, so it says the second half of this is the JavaScript to run it. Let's just take a minute and look at this. It says in the event for the DOM content loaded. Remember, that means that, for lack of better words, everything has been loaded. All right, so what they're saying is basically the DOM has been built. All right, so the first 2 statements is it says get the objects and the image element that displays the enlarged image. So you're preloading, for lack of better words, everything. Then the third statement creates an array of anchor elements. So that's setting up the thing up that's up on the top. Then, as it says, the for of loop starts by preloading the image that will be swapped. Well, usually it's going to be the first image, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. All right? But one thing to remember in all seriousness is if, let's say that you're going to do this and this is going to be on your home page, kind of like what we did for Alfanos. All right? Now, would it have been okay for me, as the first image to have up on Alfanos, to have it be calzone? Yeah. Could it have been a sub sandwich? Yeah. But they're a pizza place. So it made sense to have pizza being the one that was shown first. Again, that's my train of thought. Maybe you don't agree with that. All right? And because it made me think about it, let's see, do I still have that up here? That's Mr. Gudmiston right there, just so you know. All right. I did find his picture, so. So it says the event handler ends by canceling the default action. Remember, it's a hyperlink. We don't want it to go anywhere. We want that a bigger version of that small picture to load. So we want to do a prevent default to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. All right? So here's the JavaScript. This isn't new. All right? Now, look at in here, because what they're doing is they're saying, hey, as soon as the DOM has been created, we're not calling a function. We're doing everything inline. We talked about this, that you can do it either way. But everything is being done in here. That's the whole program. That's all the JavaScript. It may or may not make a boatload of sense to you, and it may end up making more sense at the end of the semester when we look at a little bit more of some of the stuff that you can do using object-oriented JavaScript. But things like this should make sense to you. I mean, you can put a comment there, but you know, all right, you know, they're using the $sign, so that's a query selector. All right, but we're saying instead of that, we're doing a query selector all. That's getting us all the hyperlinks. All right, this, as it says in here, is processing. So in other words, it's filling up the top of the screen. And it's also going to make sure that we set the focus. All right? So that's the one that's going to end up loading at the beginning of the program. Any questions on that? All right. Then next is timers, and we've talked again about timers before. Timers are used a lot. They're both used in code, and they're used to simulate things. Now, one thing that's been very hard for me to really get across to the people in the third semester, and you guys will probably all find it out next fall, is if I say to you, I want you to go out to this database, and I want you to grab all the records that are in a database. If you don't know what a database is, but it's like, imagine that I went out to, there's a database that's got every movie ever made. So imagine that I asked you to go out there and grab every movie. True or false? It would take a bit of time. All right? And we don't know how much time it would take. All right? And the reason that I'm telling you that is you can simulate that if you only have 3 movies by putting in a timer. So if you know it normally takes 10 seconds, you would set a timer to 10,000 because it's in milliseconds, thousandths of a second. So you could do that. So a lot of times when you're testing code and you really don't have enough records or enough information, I mean, there'd be a big difference if I was doing this class as opposed to all of Lincoln Technical College. All right, that kind of thing. All right, so as it says, they're useful in DOM scripting applications like slideshows and other things. So in here they're going to talk about 2 types of timers. The first is a timer. Again, it's a set it and forget it. And again, for example, this morning, I've got my alarm clock set. My wife thinks I'm funny because I always set the, years ago, I read a story about a guy who set his watch 10 minutes ahead, and he said he was never late for anything because he acted like that was the real time. All right, well, I kind of do the same thing, but with our alarm clock, our regular clock. So she thinks it's funny because I've got it set for 5:10. She's like, you know it's 5 o'clock. Yeah, I do. But I woke up this morning, and instead of 5:10, it said it was 5:07. So I turned it off. So I had done a set timeout, but then I did a clear timeout by turning it off. Does that make sense? All right. Just the same way, if it had gone off, and I don't hit snooze. I used to do that kind of stuff. I don't anymore. It's too easy to fall into that pattern. But let's just assume it's a weekend and I set the alarm on, geez, I don't have to get up yet. It's the weekend. So I do hit snooze. That's a set interval. And when it goes off again, if I hit it again, that's another set interval. If I say, screw it, I'm getting up, and I turn it off, that's a clear interval. That's basically what they're saying in here. All right, so if you understand that, there's not a heck of a lot more to it. As it says, when you use the set timeout to create a timer, it returns a reference to the timer that's created. All right, so you can do a clear timeout if you have to. So that's what they're going to talk about in here. So there's set timeout, there's clear timeout. But again, that's designed to call something only once. Now, since it's a timer, it's based on time. Yeah, that's smart. But it's not based on human interaction. Does that make sense? So it's not when you click a button, unless it's after you click a button, something happens in 5 seconds. That would be that kind of thing. But again, let's say that you had something where you set something up on a website where every 20 minutes some kind of an ad came down on the bottom of the screen. And you did that because they were helping pay for your site, let's say. All right? And then basically that would be a set timeout if it ran only once. But it would be a set interval if it happened every 20 minutes. All right? So there's the set timeout and the clear timeout. Again, not much change in the HTML except they added in here, in this except thing, they added an ID. And then they show you how you can use it in here. Notice in here, you can say let timer equal null, which means it doesn't have a value. Remember, if you just said let timer, its value is undefined. The main difference between undefined and null is you can test for null. You can say if timer equal null. If it's undefined, typically if you try doing a test for undefined, it won't work. All right, it might, but it might not. So as it says, set timeout returns a reference. You can use it with clear timeout. All right. Then again, the other type is an interval. So instead of using a set timeout, you use a set interval. Notice the first parameter is what you want to call. The second is the time interval between different function calls. So where we had set timeout and clear timeout, we now have set interval and clear interval. All right. This is a good example. All right. It says you will be directed to our terms of service in 2 seconds, or you can accept our new terms and stay on the page. All right. And you can say, well, couldn't you do that with a set timeout? Maybe even would have even been better. All right. So again, unlike the set timeout, the interval returns a reference to the timer again, but it can be used with clear interval. But as it says, notice that you can't modify an interval timer once it's been set in a program. If you want to modify it, so, gee, I'd like it, instead of when I hit this alarm, I'd like to take my own alarm and I'd like to program it so it goes off every 20 minutes instead of every 10 minutes. Then I'd have to cancel the interval that I have now, create a new one with a new time. And that's what they're saying here. All right, so the chapter, we're almost done, ends with this slideshow presentation. And this is the one, if you go through this, I'm not going to, unless they've changed it, and I don't think they have, because this was the same picture they had in the old edition of the book. They're not all the same size. All right? But the idea in here is what? Well, if you're going to go to the trouble of making a slideshow, one of the reasons we did that in Bootstrap was to show you that you have your choice. But you want to give people options. You want to make it as easy for them as possible. Now, with this right here, notice there's no buttons, there's nothing up here, which is going to mean, since they're talking about timers in here, that what? It's going to run on a timer. Does that make sense? All right. And probably on an interval. So every 5 seconds, let's say, change the slide. Now, you probably wouldn't find that like out on an AARP site. Because unlike young people, most older people will literally sit and stare at a picture. And they want the ability to go from one picture to another when they want to. All right. On the other hand, if you're little kids, you know, if your site is for children, you might have this set up so that every 2 seconds it changes. Why? So you can just keep giving them splash of color, splash of color, splash of color, etc. So again, like they did before, the unordered list has an ID. This paragraph where we're going to put the information has an ID, and the caption has an ID. Again, there's almost nothing for the CSS, and when we look at the JavaScript, because I think this may be the last page of the chapter, yeah it is, it's right here. So again, I'm not saying that every single bit that's in these two programs is going to totally make sense to you, but it's something you should at least be aware of. All right? And as I mentioned, as far as I remember, I don't even know, did I print that out? Let's see. Yep, I have your next test right in front of me, so let's see. As far as I can tell, looking at it in here, okay, the thing that's going to differentiate this test from the last one is two things. Number one, you're supposed to use Bootstrap for the programs that you create. Some of you did in the last one anyway, all right? But not, and I'm not talking about, they're not going to be big programs. There's not going to be boatloads of Bootstrap. The other one is virtually everything that's in here is DOM scripting. Looking at it quickly, I don't think there's a thing in there about debugging, and I don't think there's a thing in there about image swapping, timers, etc. So if we're going to concentrate on one, we're going to just concentrate on Chapter 6. All right? Any questions? All right, then the rest of the period today will be lab. I'm going to do it right now so I don't forget. I'm going to try to set you three up. All right? And then I'm going to resend your passwords after I reset them. And I'm going to ask that by the end of the class, when you get in, you're just going to have, it's going to be a file, an HTML file that I put in there with an H1 tag that says test document. But the point is, you will all be able to get to, and they already can, you will be able to get to that, and you can give that to anybody. So again, the idea behind that is when you get done with your web portfolio, so it's this summer, these two guys here have one more class to take, right? All right, but they're thinking, you know what, maybe I can get a job or at least part-time or whatever. Now they have a place where they can push people out to. All right, you'll still have GitHub pages if you want to use that. And there's other things that we use in the third semester class. We use a thing called Heroku. All right, so if there aren't any other questions, then the rest of the period is yours. And again, last thing I'll say, promise, and that is that next week we will go over, it's only 8 through 11. It's not 8 through 12. So that's even better. So next week, when we go through this, it'll be 8 and 9 and 10 and 11. All right? So that's what we'll do next week. So the following week, not next week, the following week. On Monday, we'll go through 8 and 9, fast start with jQuery and effects and animation. And then Tuesday, we'll go over forms and data validation and jQuery plugins and widgets. All right? And no test, no homework on that. All right? There were no questions. I'm finished.